Now I'm loaded. Geez, I need to develop a cough or something. I like water. My heaviest drink is carbonated water. I used to drink juice. I used to love lemonade. I never really liked fizzy drinks, the sodas. There's some like never that I don't like at all. What can I say? I like water. Hi, Troy. Here's Troy Jones, everybody, our hero behind the scenes, our tech guy. Oh, why they couldn't see me before?
No, we are seeing you.
Oh, okay. Now you can hear me, everybody?
Yes.
Nice, good group. Hello, London. Hi, back there. Hi, cousin Iris. We're
Hi,
from the
cousin.
same. We found out. It's a great story. Oh, thank you, Nancy. Oh, now I've got not just one. I have three. Be bloated by the time we're
I'm
done.
the only one that can't hear it.
So Iris and I found out that our families were from the same little shtetl in Ukraine, Skvira, which is well known, but at peak only had like 6,500 Jews living there. And Iris's family and my family, both, I guess, pretty.
They had to have known each other. I mean, there's no question. I think if we did some DNA, Rabbi, we would find we're blood relatives somewhere.
Oh, I didn't hear that, Iris. I'm sorry.
We were to check our DNA, we'd find out we were truly blood
Probably.
relatives, but I'm calling you cousin anyway.
It's right. It's that third cousin of that we had back then. We're third cousins.
Whatever,
They married each other.
whatever.
Did you know that? But what a small world, you know, just
I love it. It's the Jewish world.
it's so cute. It's a Jewish world. But I read about Skvira, boy, when I don't remember when your family left. My mother's family left in 1921 during they were
Mine
all
left,
killing
yeah.
each other.
Mine left 2 years earlier,
That's right, 1919. It was
1919.
so bad between 1917 and 1921. They were getting with the pogroms every other day, and the Jewish population shrunk almost in half just in a couple of years. So you can only imagine how bad it was. I'm
My
lucky.
mother remembers carrying a sack of salt when they had to leave to go someplace else. And they had salt. So they were carrying this sack of salt. It was something they could trade for food and so forth.
Wow. Well, what can I say? It was a bad time. We're lucky my grandmother was 24 when she left. She was young enough to go, and my grandfather. But we're the lucky ones. You imagine if we had to stay there during the Civil War and then the Stalin and all the mess that my wife's family had to leave Ukraine in the 1920s. But what I think we should do to start, it's Kristallnacht anniversary. Today is the day. The 9th and the 10th of November were the days in 1938 when literally Germany and Austria were set on fire, Jewish Germany and Austria. And of course, that really was the trigger. Not that the Holocaust, the Shoah didn't have years of preparation before, but that's when the world should have known, everybody should have known that this was the beginning of the end. Because you imagine being there, and we're going to hear about a lot of this from the Austrian perspective tomorrow with Ambassador Weidinger, Christoph. But you can imagine being there and seeing your synagogue, all the synagogues in your town just burning on fire, and the police watching, encouraging people to do it. And then we're wondering, where do you go after this? And I'm looking at Claire here, my dear friend from London from the past. Our synagogue in London was just built upon the flames of Kristallnacht. And those Jews who were lucky enough to get out after that came to London, because UK was one of the few places that actually allowed Jews to come in not large numbers, but enough that Jews were able to reestablish themselves and build a synagogue in London. But they all had so many of them left their families behind. They perished in the Shoah. So I just thought we would just begin with 30 seconds of silence to try to reflect on the screams and the hollers and the cries of so many of our people who that night really knew that their futures were completely in the balance of fate. Let's begin. Zichronam livracha. Their memory be a blessing. I'll tell you one good story, and Claire is my witness. She was on one of our great trips that we took to Berlin. Remember, we went to the Golden Dome Synagogue and the
Yes.
fabulous museum there.
Wonderful.
What was it called again? Orenstrasse.
Ryanbergstrasse.
All these names are so long. Yeah, the Golden Dome. When you go to Berlin, you see the largest synagogue. The dome still remains intact. I mean, they burned most of the synagogue to the ground. But remember, we heard the story from what was his name? Oh, one who just passed away, Peter. What was his last name? Who was with us and passed away? Peter. Not Belson.
Oh no, I
Peter
know
and
his
his
name. I've
and
forgotten his
Judy and what was his name?
Oh,
Oh, you
completely gone
forgot
out of
too.
my
That's
mind.
great. Oh, it's
A
not just
very,
Peter.
very great man with a walking stick and a bow tie, and always very
Yeah, what was his name? He was a
dressed.
very eccentric guy, but
Yeah.
very dedicated Jew. Anyway,
Yeah.
he was making sure, because there was no heat, there was nothing in the synagogue, but he was trying to assemble as many minyanim as possible to maintain whatever vestige of life. And he had to deal with so many Jews who were committing suicide, tens every day. And he made sure that every Jew had an appropriate burial.
Mm.
Do you remember that story? This
Yes.
hero?
Yes.
He was
Yeah.
doing like 7, 8, up to 10 funerals every day. That was all he was doing all day long. He made sure that there was Shiva, made sure that there was Kaddish recited, made sure there was at least some semblance of dignity left. I remember us being so moved by that story. Just incredible, the tenacity of Jews to hold on to life, even when I can't imagine functioning in that kind of environment. Yeah, sure.
Mm.
Happy birthday then. Yeah, I know. Well, that's the celebration. You're here learning about Jewish life. So think about that. Yeah, happy birthday then. All right, stay forever young. Yeah, life is the response to sadness and death. Okay, let's continue where we left off. We are our unit is on the synagogue, and we're going to get into the Chumash today, into all the facets of Jewish prayer. So we had concluded last week, according to my notes, we had left. The subject was Jewish dress, and we finished with the kippah, with head coverings. So, and then we moved to, the second aspect of Jewish dress, which is the tzitzit. tzitzit. And again, first of all, the essence of the prayer shawl, the talit, is the tzitzit, nothing else. You can have all kinds of colors. Shatnez is the mixture of fabrics is an issue, but generally you can have any wrap that you want, but the tzitzit are what makes a talit. And as we read, it is commanded in the Torah. It is in the third paragraph of the Shema that's recited every morning and every evening. It's from the last 5 verses of the 15th chapter of the book of Numbers. And we discuss the origins of that. From ancient Egypt, we know where it comes from. The wearing of the tassels of the garments was a particular Egyptian attire. And certainly those Israelite slaves of ours who left Egypt were very much aware of their cultural environment and what dress meant. Dress meant what your social status was, whether it be of a slave or a slave owner or a taskmaster. All the different castes in Egypt had different fringes on the corners of their garments. So what did the genius Israelites, before there were Jews, decide, as we hear in the Torah? A human being cannot belong to another human being. A human being, just because one is wealthier than another, doesn't mean anyone is any more special than another human being, because ultimately we all belong to God and God alone. And that's why the uniformity of the white tassels or the tzitzit on the 4 corners of the garment. The only variation you will see is that now we are able to have a blue thread.
How many people?
21. I want to just see the volume is maximum.
Oh, we got to turn off the mute, everybody. Mute, because I get feedback. Then it's hard to hear. Thank you. So it's a brilliant observation of heaven and earth, of the partnership between God and the people, that all the people, and in fact, what extended in Judaism was that all people belong to God, cannot belong to another human being. It was the pulse, by the way, that ultimately the prophets and all of Judaism slavery. That's much later. I don't know when racial slavery began. Off the cuff, I would say, 15th, 16th century. And then the hideous racial theories of the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and even into the 20th century. But slavery was not based upon that in the Torah. It was based upon economics. But even then, it was eventually wiped out. There's all, listen, I'll give a sermon when we get to Mishpatim about that. But so this brilliant idea that all of Israel is a mamlechet kohanim, a nation of priests, which is the phraseology that's used in the book of Exodus, an Am Kadosh, a holy nation, was taken very seriously. And you imagine how revolutionary that was, that human beings couldn't belong to another human being. And even the way that we mark our coming to the Torah, we sign the contract of the covenant when we take our tzitzit and we touch the beginning before the brachot that we recite bracha at the beginning, the laning, the reading, and then the blessings recited. And before the second blessing, we also touch the Torah where we're reading. Hopefully we'll get back to that normal, beautiful practice soon. So that's the origin of the meaning of the talit. The word tzitzit in the Hebrew, tzadi yud tav, spells out the number 600. Tzadi is 90, a tav is 400, and then you've got the other tzadi, which is another 90, So that's 580, and then you've got the 2 yuds, that's 20, comes up to 600. And then you add the 8 strands that are part of the way that the strands are, the tzitzit are put together. And then if you'll notice at the end of the tzitzit, there are 5 knots on each corner, which symbolizes the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Torah. And so you've got 600 plus 8 plus 5 comes out to 613, which are the symbolic of the commandments in the Torah. And so that's where it comes from. When we wear a talit, we're saying that we belong to God, everyone does, and that we are, as Jews, committed to observing the commandments. And in that paragraph, again, I don't want to deviate too much, but if we looked at the paragraph in the Shema, which we'll get to again when we do the Siddur, it says you have to look upon the tzitzit, you have to remember them as hartem otam, avyasitem otam, then you have to do them. It's all about the Jewish relationship of ourselves to the commandments, of observing, kissing the word tzitzit the 3 times when we reach the last paragraph of the Shema, and of course, affirming our commitment to fulfilling those commandments. What a beautiful ritual. Then the question is, how about women and the wearing of a talit? Well, this is an interesting history. We really don't know. We're going to get to this with the Torah reading, when the women were doing almost all the Torah reading back in the days of the early synagogues. It was very interesting how that halakha developed. We don't know at all whether women, well, share with you also, which I didn't put in my notes, about mixed seating, men and women. That's an interesting history as well. We don't know exactly if and when women were wearing a talit. Was it the garment only of men? It appears to be so in ancient Egypt, so that it probably was. But the question is the way that the meaning of the wearing of the tzitzit developed as a commitment to the commandments. So the way that Jewish law developed was that men are responsible for all commandments, only men, for time-bound commandments, which means that anything that has to be done in the morning, you cannot recite the Shema 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's obligation in the morning and the evening. So those commandments that are time-bound, such as times of prayer, wearing of the tzitzit, the wearing of tefillin, which also can only be worn in the morning, are only obligations of men. That's the way Orthodox Jewish law developed. But the question is, what happens if a woman binds herself to the time-bound commandments, which we know that Rashi's daughters did back in the 12th century. 12th or 11th century. I always get these dates. Let's see. Maimonides died in 1205, so that's 10th century, 1100s. So they bound themselves to the commandments. And Rashi wrote a whole dissertation about if a woman commits herself to the commandments, then she becomes obligated to the commandments and therefore can make others also, like leading prayer and all those other things, because at that point, a woman commits herself to embracing the time constrictions of the command. For example, things like keeping kosher, putting a mezuzah on the door, which are not time-bound, are obligated for both men and women. That's the stringent Orthodox law. So it's only these time-bound commandments. So it's a little bit murky there. Now, the way that Orthodox custom developed, most Orthodox synagogues, not all now, most feel that a woman should not take upon herself that obligation to keep the commandments. There is a very prominent Orthodox rabbi at Bar Ilan University who is written a very large halachic dissertation about why women should be time bound by the commandments. Also, David Hartman, a lot of Yitzhak Greenberg, a lot of other prominent Orthodox rabbis have finally come around to what the conservative movement did years ago. And that is that if a woman is bound by the commandments, she can not only wear a talit, she's technically obligated to do so, just like men. The question that developed, that changed the rabbinical assembly's attitude towards women and the ritual, was, of course, if you're training the young women, the girls, to become benot mitzvah, come to the Torah, become a daughter of the commandments, accepting the commandments, then they're really taking upon the obligation, like all men, to observe the commandments for the rest of their lives. There's some who feel that women need a little slack because the way they grew up, they weren't quite ready to wear a talit, and so therefore they want to come to the Torah, not wear a talit yet. A lot of conservative congregations have obligated women to embrace the same commandments as the men, mitzvot. So if a woman were to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable wearing a talit when I recite the brachot at the Torah, a lot of congregations said, you know what, then you cannot come to the Torah like any other man, must wear a talit when coming up. I believe in a little bit of a bend here, a little elastic approach, and allow women to approach these changes in their own due time. I think that women should be encouraged to understand that if they feel that they themselves are obligated to the commandments, that they should be aware that wearing a talit, covering the head, wearing tefillin or whatever, are part of Jewish life, that we're not making those distinctions as we did before. We can understand why in the 11th century, it must have been very difficult for a woman to commit herself to the daily commandments, because there was, raising children is not easy now. Can you imagine what it was like in the 11th century? They couldn't be obligated to come to the synagogue at 7 o'clock in the morning and to daven with the rest of the community. Yeah, I don't want to make any sweeping comments regarding that, but it makes a lot of sense that women were given, there is no prohibition in Jewish law that says women cannot wear a talit. There is a Torah commandment says that women should dress like women. There shouldn't be any cross-dressing. But that is not a prohibition on wearing. If you regard a talit entirely as a male dress, that becomes like an out for you to prohibit women. But I find that incomprehensible, because it's a ritual garment, and there's nothing that would prevent a woman from wearing any garment that has tassels on the sides. Yes, Adrian. Well, head covering, as I mentioned last week, is really more difficult because even men technically are not obligated to wear a kippah. It is a minhag that's become so ingrained as part of our way that we show respect for the mitzvot and under God, that it's become more obligated for men, because technically women are only obligated to cover their heads if they are married. But if they're single, they're not obligated at all. But the obligation for men, this is all murky area that's developing here. A lot of congregations, again, are requiring women to have their heads covered no matter what. But I think we would have a lot of difficulties in our congregation, a lot of women are still not comfortable taking upon that obligation. Now, there's nothing wrong with encouraging it. There's nothing wrong in applauding it, in making our women feel as comfortable as possible to where they are in their Jewish journeys. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where that stands. So we're encouraging, we're pushing it. There's been a lot of progress in conservative congregations in these last years. More and more women are taking upon the obligations of the mitzvot. That's why we have women rabbis now in the conservative movement. They're doing what the men are doing, which is fine. The same with tefillin. Now, tefillin, and where do we find the earliest talitot? I would guess like tefillin back in I think the earliest tefillin we have were from the Dead Sea Scrolls, that area, and also from the Bar Kokhba era. I know in the Israel Museum they have ancient 2nd century talitot and tefillin. What's remarkable about tefillin, the black boxes, is they look very much the same as the tefillin that we wear today. There are 4 passages in the Torah that require us to place the Shema, the 2 passages in the first 2 paragraphs in the Shema, and the 2 other references in the book of Exodus to the wearing of tefillin, and to bind them upon our heads and as frontlets between our eyes and upon our arms as well. And it is an ancient Jewish tradition. We know in the Talmud that there were some men, I'm not sure there are any references to women here, but certainly men who wore their tefillin all day long. There was a lot of controversy about that because there was there's always a refrain in rabbinic law in the Talmud about trying to be too pious. One of the most interesting discussions is about whether Yom Kippur should have an extra fast day. Can you imagine if we had an extra fast day? I don't know what that second day of Yom Kippur would be like, but it's an interesting question because all the other holidays in outside of the land of Israel have an extra day. So why not Yom Kippur? And so the rabbi's general ruling was, don't be super pious. Don't think that you have to fast for 48 hours. 25 is enough. You don't have to do it for 50 hours. And so the halakha developed in this very interesting idea is fast one day, it's done, and don't be super holy, because that's not something we try to do. So tefillin, as I think I know that the Shabbat are only wore on weekdays, not on holidays, not on Shabbat. Controversy about whether you wear it during Chol HaMoed, Sukkot, and Pesach. The Sephardim don't. The Ashkenazic generally do. It had to do with the work schedules, frankly, the way that developed. So you have this hodgepodge during Sukkot and Pesach. I'm a Sephardic Jew this week. I'm not wearing tefillin. Get all kinds of responses there. But tefillin is a beautiful, beautiful ritual. My tefillin are from my great-grandfather from Skvira, by the way, Iris. And I still have them, still use them. I've had to change the parchment inside, but they still, as for they're huge. They used to wear huge boxes back then, but it's still meaningful for me to wear them every day. And we bind them upon our head, of course, and by our heart. If we're right-handed, we're on the left side. If we're left-handed, we wear on the right side. Has to do with a verse in Ezekiel, which is a little complicated. And it probably doesn't work because of the lefties, but I still like the idea that when we are bound to God, we're obligated to use our minds and our hearts, the emotional side and the intellectual side. And it takes those 2 components to really be a proper observant Jew. And of course, seven strands on the arm that we tie the ritzuah, the black leather straps, symbolizing the days of creation. And there are many different variations on the way that tefillin are ultimately tied on the hand. But usually, if I were to show you spelling the Hebrew word Shin, Daled, Yud, which is a name of God, Shaddai, which means Almighty. And since it's not dress, there is of course, a special way that we put on tefillin. We recite the blessing. We place the shel yad, as it's called, on the arm first, and tie our hands. We don't do the final, and then we place the shel yad on our head, recite the blessing, place on the shel rosh of the head, and then we finish the tying on the hand, so that we don't dress like putting on. We all have our different patterns, the way we get dressed in the morning, but tefillin, because it's a religious garb, we put on a certain way. Okay, that's tefillin, and the same issues regarding tefillin and talit of women would apply to tefillin as well, tefillin talit. So let's now, I hope all of you have at least a copy of a Chumash there, but I want to, my goal here is to get you all very well acquainted with this beautiful Eitz Chaim Chumash, whose idea it was of my colleague and friend, who is the former chancellor of the seminary, Ismar Shorsh. Claire, again, will remember his visit to London. And I just want to go through this a little bit, because many of us are not as quite as familiar with the way that this Chumash works. So I want to go through this page by page with you. Generally, there are different Chumashim, by the way. This is not the Chumash that's used by Jews all over the world in every synagogue. The Orthodox have their own. The Reform have theirs. Ours is very good because it contains what should be in a Chumash. Chumash, the word Chumash, comes from Chamesh, the number 5. And that's easy to figure out, the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Torah. It is to be used primarily during the Torah reading. You can certainly use it at home, but the prime use of the Chumash is for use in the synagogue during the Torah reading. And in a Chumash, what you have is the layout of the Torah readings and the prophetic readings and all the little doodads that we're going to go through during the course of the year. So it's a companion to the prayer book. It is for the Torah reading, which is the most important part of our service, by the way. The idea of the Torah reading is to reenact Sinai, to redo it, because Shabbat morning is all about revelation of Sinai, but we'll get to how that all is put together. So that's a Chumash. You'll see Chumashim with the commentary of Rashi, along with the Torah text. You'll see Chumashim that don't have any translations. You'll see Chumashim with just the Hebrew and an Aramaic translation called Targum Onkelos, which can accompany. But the basic framework here is the Torah reading, the set Torah readings, and the prophetic readings, the Haftarot for the year. So let's go through these pages. We have a table of contents. I don't know these pages. Oh yeah, it's page Roman numeral 10. There are 54 portions during the year. Now you might ask the question, what happens in a shortened year, which there are only 50 weeks or 52 weeks? There is a long-standing tradition of certain portions of the 54 which are combined during shorter years. And as we're now approaching a leap year this year, those shorter portions will be separated into separate portions during the course of the year. So 54 portions. And I think I mentioned here before that if you go into an Orthodox synagogue, you will find all these. I also wanted to talk about mixed seating. Remind me about mixed seating, where that came from, and separate seating. If you go to most Orthodox synagogue, I hate these blanket statements, but generally you'll find that in every Orthodox synagogue, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, they will read the entire portion of the week every Shabbat, which can be very long, some portions. In our synagogue, we read what's called the triennial portion, third. And we, over the course of 3 years, we read the entire Torah. We don't cut anything. We read the entire Torah over 3 years. How did we get away with that one? It's a good question. Because if you have someone who's used to being in an Orthodox synagogue, and they come in our synagogue and say, oh, they're abbreviating, they're cutting it down. There is ample historical precedent for what we do. 2,000 years ago, there were two large Jewish communities. One that's centered in the land of Israel, called the Jerusalem community, and the other was Chutz La'aretz, the diaspora community, the Galut, the Jews who lived in Egypt and Babylonia and all those other places outside of Israel. The Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, we know from the Second Temple period, read the Torah over a 3-year period. They started the reading, their calendar was based upon the biblical calendar, which was Nisan, the month of Pesach. That was the first month. If you were a Jew living in Jerusalem in the year 200 BCE, you wouldn't have known what the heck Rosh Hashanah was. You would know it as the 7th month. What are you guys doing having your major celebration of the New Year? Our New Year's in Nisan, the month of Passover. That's when we began as a people. They read the Torah starting with the 1st of Nisan, with the book of Genesis, and they went in chronological order. It's almost as if they took each of our portions, divided them, and we do have their divisions. This writer, I think, I forgot his name, man, was able to share with us. I don't have that book anymore. All the way that they broke up the Torah readings back then. So they started in April 10th, no, even before the end of March, and they read the Torah over a 3-year period in consecutive order. Now, the Jews in what's called the Babylonian Jews, they were influenced by the Babylonian calendar, which began in the fall, in the autumn. And they started shifting from Eretz Yisrael to the Babylonian way. And over a yearly cycle, there was the major feast in Babylonia was the coronation of the king god every year in the fall. So there was a switch culturally, a massive switch. That's how our calendar changed. And our calendar then was dated from the 1st of Tishrei, which was in the fall. That's why we have Rosh Hashanah, blasting the shofar to mark the new year. We are, in essence, the Babylonian Jewish community exercised its clout over the Eretz Yisrael Jews, who were weakened, especially after the destruction of the temple in the year 70. The shift was to the diaspora. Those Jews wanted to be on a yearly cycle. So they changed the Torah reading cycle to 54 portions, as we have here, and they read the Torah over 1-year cycle. They invented the holiday of Simchat Torah, which does not appear in the Torah at all, to mark the end of the Torah reading cycle of the year and the beginning back to the beginning. So you had two different Jewish communities with two different traditions. So the dilemma here is what happened in the conservative congregations. My friend Joel Rembaum in Los Angeles, who was the rabbi of the synagogue I grew up in, and we're still in close contact, wrote the tshuva for the conservative movement. With all of this research, I think that anybody could really get this off of the Rabbinical Assembly website. Maybe it's only available to members. I don't remember. But he wrote about, it must have been about 40 years ago now, when he said, you have, because what was happening in conservative congregations is that a lot of lay Jews were finding it impossible to stay awake during the long Torah reading. They couldn't deal with it every week. Sometimes the Torah reading would last 40 minutes. And then you had to find, you imagine if we had to find Torah readers for the entire portion? I might have Ben and Susan shaking their heads, who always read every week, and no way would we be able to do that. So you can imagine how rabbis were getting taxed every week reading the whole portion. So Joel said we've got to do something in our synagogues, and we've got to find a legitimate way of abbreviating the Torah reading. So he wrote the tshuva, and he said, listen, we're taking on the tradition of Jerusalem Jews who read the Torah over a 3-year cycle. The only difference, though, is because what was the dilemma? Now that we have Simchat Torah, we have Rosh Hashanah, we've already changed the calendar. You can't, if the conservative synagogues were reading the Torah from Breshit over a 3-year period, we would be reading, I don't know where we would be. Let's say we would be in the end of the book of Numbers right now, finishing up the last triennial, while the rest of the Jewish community was reading from Breshit. We'd be totally out of whack with the rest of the Jewish world. So that was not a good alternative to simply embrace what Jews did in Israel 2,200 years ago. So he came up with a compromise plan. Let's read a third based upon the yearly cycle. And what we'll do over a 3-year period, we'll read the first triennial, second triennial, third triennial, and we will read the entire Torah like the Jews did in Eretz Yisrael, but we won't be out of sync with the rest of the Jewish world. We'll be able to keep Simchat Torah, and so we combine both traditions. That's where it comes from. Very interesting history. So listen, my goal here is that everybody understand what we do. If you find that a little contrived, Ismar Shorsh, by the way, was my dear teacher and mentor at the seminary. He was totally opposed to the triennial cycle. He insisted that the entire portion be read every week. And I would guess that there's still some conservative synagogues that read the whole portion. Not many left, but some. Yeah, Roberta? Yeah. We don't. We read only a third. The question was asked, it appears in our synagogue that we're reading the whole portion, but we don't every week. Now, there are some portions, especially at the end of the year, that are so short. Nitzavim, Vayelech, Ha'azinu, where we read and some synagogues, so when we get to Yitros, another one that's not long enough to really split up, and you want to make sure that the 10 Commandments are read. And there are many synagogues who have the option of reading for that particular portion, the entire portion. But we only read a third. We don't read the whole portion every week. And I think that's a good sign that what we're reading is a good enough length. It allows us to engage in the text and not, because it is, even for me, when I'm in synagogue in Israel, and I go to an Orthodox synagogue, it's long. I start looking at the Rashi, because most of the synagogues have Rashi commentary but it's long sitting there for 45 minutes during the entire reading. And then they add aliyot beside. I mean, you could be there all morning long. I don't think that would be too. What if I were to say to you guys today, We're reading the whole portion, and we're going to be here from 9:30 to 1 o'clock. Susan's shaking her head. Our ritual chairman is saying, no way, Rabbi. Don't worry, I'm not going to do that. So anyway, but I think we have a good balance, and we're keeping it that way. So anyway, let's go on here, and then we'll take more questions. It's always fast. So here you have the list of the 54 portions in order. And of course, this week we're reading the 7th portion, Vayetze, from the book of Genesis, Breshit. So if you turn the page to Roman numeral 12, there is a listing of the special prophetic portions, the Haftarot, for the special times of the year, because usually, well, we'll get to the Haftarah. Then there's a table of contents on page 13, which is, I always tell people, this is such a gold mine for us that most of us do not take advantage of. There are articles written by our great scholars and rabbis in the back of the book, the back of the Chumash, dealing, as you can see, an array of subjects: biblical life and perspectives, biblical religion and law, worship, ritual, and halakha. And some of the passages written by many of my teachers who are no longer with us today. They've passed on. Roman numeral 14 is a continuation of the contents. On the next page, page 15, Roman numeral, you have the Torah readings. I don't know why the order was to put the Torah readings after the special Haftarot, but that's it. The table of contents here is the special Torah readings for those times in the year when we have different Torah readings to read, from Rosh Chodesh all the way to the Israel and Yom Ha'atzmaut and Shavuot, all the way to the end on the fast days. On page 17 is a little bit of an introduction from Ismar Shorsh. That's a name you should know. It would be great to have him here too. He's an incredible scholar, Jewish history. May 2000. He was very helpful when I was studying for my doctorate. Page 18 and 19 is another great introduction on how the translation of this text came about. They essentially took the translation of the Jewish Publication Society, which was a committee of about 12 and headed by my teacher, Jacob Milgram. So the English translation is, there's always going to be questions about a translation. I pointed out one little interesting thing this last Shabbat, in which it said that they named Jacob, and it's translated as he named Jacob. So a lot of thought is put into that. We'd have to, there is a commentary on the translation that I used to have, I don't have anymore. And it explains the difference in commentaries on page 20 of Midrash, that is more expansive commentary. There's Pshat commentary, which is the simple meaning of the text. There is a section at the, well, we'll look at all the details here before we do. Then there's all kinds of acknowledgments here at the end, signed by David Lieber on Roman numeral page 24. He was another one of my teachers. He was the chancellor of the University of Judaism when I was there, and a close family friend because he taught with my uncle Earl at Northridge, Cal State Northridge as well. Okay, then we get to Genesis. You see the big letters there, Breshit, Genesis, and the listing in Hebrew of the 12 portions of the book of Genesis. We're at the halfway point right now. Then you turn the page, which is technically page 2, and you'll see that there is a summary of the book of Genesis by Nahum M. Sarna. He passed away probably 15 years ago. One of the great biblical scholars. His book, Understanding Genesis and Understanding Exodus, are still must reads. And so, of course, he was a scholar of the, I'm not sure if he was a conservative rabbi, probably was. His son, Jonathan Sarn, is a great professor of American Jewish history. He also was a big help when I was writing my book. His book on American Jewish history is fantastic. So those Sarnas have a wonderful legacy. Then if you turn to page 3, you'll see that this Chumash does a couple of things. It has the Hebrew text in the upper column. It has, of course, the name of the portion, Breshit in transliteration. And then it has the Hebrew text, and here we only have 6 letters, followed by, on the left-hand side, the translation. And then there's underneath the Hebrew, there are little critical notes that are taken from a traditional Masoretic. The Masoretes were the ones who set the trope, the cantillations, and the final text for us between the 6th and the 9th centuries in the Galilee. That's where they did their work. So these little critical notes are interesting. It says there, bet. You see here that what's unusual is the bet is enlarged. And you'll see the same thing in the written Torah scroll. And then there's a little note that says verse 1, bet rabati, the reason why it is enlarged, lefi nusachim mekubalim. That is in accordance with the traditional nusach, the traditional Masoretic formulation. If you see a Torah scroll that doesn't have an enlarged bet, you really can't use it. Underneath there is a caption called creation with the chapters and verses. Chapter 1, the critical notation, chapter 1, verse 1 through, with the dash, chapter 2, verse 3 with an introduction. And those are basically simple pshat. Pshat means simple. Doesn't mean it's simple, but basic commentary on the text. So here in note 1, it explains the English translation, which is usually in the beginning. The conventional English translation reads, in the beginning, God created the earth. The translation presented here looks to verse 3 for the completion of the sentence and takes the creation narrative in the Bible as a document of faith. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong side here. Really has to go on to the next page. Verse 2 to be parenthetical, describing the state of things at the time when God first spoke. And that's become a more acceptable translation. Underneath the line is a vast array of midrash, some of it traditional, some of it more contemporary. There are citations from the midrash. If, for example, here you have midrash on the word Breshit. What does the word when the beginning come from? And I see here that the what is the meaning of the bet, etc. Now turn the page and look at the bottom of page 5. So this, and again, when you're in synagogue here, you have, again, top of the line are the more simple, specific vocabulary type of explanations, etymologies, origins of words, with different categorizations of subjects, and below the line, more expansive midrashic commentary. We can take any of those. For example, the bottom of page 4, let there be light. If you see that light, the first thing God created, Vayahi Or, can be seen as symbolizing Judaism's commitment to clarity rather than mystery, to openness rather than concealment, to study rather than blind faith. That's a beautiful, beautiful commentary. And if you note on page 5, these were put together by another dear friend of mine, Elliot Dorff, the Halacha L'Maaseh. That is, how do some of these verses apply? Halacha L'Maaseh means Jewish law for the doing. So here, verse 5, the comment there, by the way, the purpose of this is to allow you to be enriched by the text in front of you. It's a great tool. And here it says there was evening and there was morning. What do we know about the evening and the morning? Our holidays begin in the evening, not the morning. Erev Rosh Hashanah, Erev Pesach, Erev Chanukah, Erev Shabbat. And it's based upon this verse. There was evening and there was morning. Vayehi Erev, Vayehi Voker. The evening comes first, which is very important because unlike our secular calendar, I don't know about you, I'm usually asleep, but at 12 midnight, the day changes. There's really no difference between 11:50 in terms of the darkness of 11:59 p.m. and 12:01 a.m. I'm asleep, nothing happens. But in Jewish terms, you cannot mark the change of the day unless you note that as an act of God. And so what happens is when day turns into night, it's beautiful. There's a transformation of nature. And so therefore, that's how our calendar is different from the Roman secular one, which is, to me, of course, so basic. The sighting of the new moon. November 1st came about. Did anybody mark, when you were sleeping, it's 12 midnight and November 1st popped up. So you might say, oh, it's November 1st, a new month. But in the Jewish calendar, it's always marked by the citation of the new moon, which is a beautiful way of marking the calendar. So in many ways, just as a thought here, if we're to teach the world to be more attuned to the environment and what that environment means in terms of creation, and God's presence in it, and our obligations, we should think of ways of looking to these Jews, to the Torah, that saw a way of marking every stage of nature, of our being. It's a beautiful way of marking those changes. It's like everything with Kashrut, with Shabbat, everything is so unique in Jewish terms. So anyway, what Eli has done here, according to Jewish law, the 24-hour cycle begins at sunset. Shabbat and holy days therefore begin in the evening with candles lit 18 minutes before sunset. 18 life. That's just to make sure that you light candles before it turns dark, and continue until the following night when 3 stars can, again, how do you mark the end of Shabbat, the day? When you see 3 stars in the sky. What a beautiful lesson that would be for our kids, to be in tune with the changes of seasons and the cycles of time. Or 25 minutes after sunset, if no stars are visible. In Chicago, between November and February, you rarely see the stars or anything. So that's very real, depending where you live, but not in Sarasota, where it's clear every Saturday night. On determining the beginning of Shabbat, and then you have a citation, S-A-O-H. Those are important. Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim. There are 4 parts of the legal code from 1588. So it's Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, the Orach Chaim, which means the length of life, the CE for the passage 261, the first 4 references 1 through 4. So everything has so if you say, I don't buy that, you can open up your own Shulchan Aruch and you'll find a much greater discussion about when the days begin. So that's wonderful. Now, I want you to note, we can do this randomly. Oh, one thing before we do that. On page 5, you'll see at the end of the paragraph, there's a pay. That is in a sense to mark, that's traditional, to mark the end of a passage, like a paragraph. It's almost a good way of psik, it's called a stopping. That's what it literally means. This is really interesting. When we announce the Torah reading, we tell our people chapter 14, verse 23 on page 94. I don't look it up because it's probably wrong. I'm using it as an example. When you study the Talmud and they cite, let's say, a passage from Deuteronomy, they don't cite Deuteronomy 29:3. They'll just recite the verse. Sometimes they will give an indication of what portion it's in. The Ha'azinu, Deuteronomy 33:15. There were no chapters and no verses back then. No. So when we say chapter 30 of Genesis, and you were studying with Rashi, you would know what the heck you were talking about. Maimonides knew nothing about chapters and verses. He knew portions. He knew the paragraphs in the Torah. He knew where the Masoretes had indicated the Torah cantillations, but the endings of the verses we have today were not so clear. They were, in most cases, obvious. But anyway, there was an abbot in France. I don't even remember his name. You can look it up. In the 14th century, very clever guy. He said, and because the Catholic Church didn't have chapters and verses either. They just had long narrative of the Bible. So this abbot said, I'm going to systematize. I'm glad he spent his time in the monastery doing something very constructive that not only did Christians embrace, but also Jews. And he divided the Bible into chapters and verses. That's why you'll see, by the way, sometimes when we're reading the Torah, you'll see that a beginning of an aliyah will begin with the last verse from the previous chapter rather than verse 1. That's because in Jewish terms of where divide the portions, we disagreed with the poor abbot of France. But he did almost a very good job because he divided the Bible into chapters and verses, which has become universally used not only by the conservative movement, but Orthodox Jews. You open up any Chumash. By the way, this is a good lesson in understanding how we Jews, even the most religious of the religious, have adopted things that we've brought in from the outside. This was not a Jewish creation. It was this interesting, and now everybody uses it, even the Haredim. Genesis, Exodus chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments. Maimonides wouldn't have known that. Rabbi Akiva certainly wouldn't have known that, etc. So it's fascinating where all these things come from. Yeah, sure. Yeah, whatever. I forgot his name. No. Those were our names. The portions belong to us. All he did was divide the Bible into chapters and verses. That's why it's good to get a Jewish translation of the Bible, because in a good translation, you'll see not only the chapters and verses, but every section divided in the Torah portion, and usually reference to the prophetic portion. So very interesting. So that's how, when you see what the Chumash tries to do, is to show you where the paragraphing of the Masoretes occurred, marked by the psik, by the stops. They're called stops. Now, if you look at the top of page 5, for those, I know that Ben and Susan know this, but every verse of the entire Tanakh, not just the Torah, is marked by ta'amim, or we call them trope, musical notations. Remember this. Where does this come from? We know this is very ancient and goes back to the Second Temple period, except that the Masoretes must have taken over 300-year period, must have taken a massive amounts of different traditions in the way the text was cantillated and unified the cantillation for Jews that we use today in every synagogue, conservative, reform, I don't know about reform, Orthodox for sure. Now, what is the music there for? Remember, if you were a Jew living in the year 0, you didn't have a prayer book in front of you. The way of memorizing or learning for yourself, people back then in general, not just Jews, were much keener about memorization because they didn't have books. The music enabled Jews to remember passages just on the musical formula. And it was also a good way of memorizing a text. And it was also a good way of keeping people alert. Because if I were to read verses 4 and 5, you see the little numbers there, 4 and 5, verse 4, chapter 1, and I just read it. Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, v'yavdel Elohim bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech, vayikra Elohim la'or yom, v'la'choshech kara laila, vayehi erev, vayehi voker yom echad. That's very interesting, Rabbi, but very dull. But if I were to chant those verses, and I have thousands of people in the Temple Mount hearing the reading of the Torah, it's a lot different to sing, Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov, v'yavdel Elohim bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech, vayikra Elohim la'or yom v'la'choshech kara laila, vayivoker yom echad. I mean, what a beautiful tradition we have. And that's what the musical notations did. For those of you musicians, the Torah reading is to be read in a major mode. The Haftarah, to distinguish it from the Torah reading, is to be read in a minor mode. And you know, for those of you who know music, the third of the chord progressions are a half step lower in minor mode. And for those of you also music interest, the only national anthem of any nation in the world that was composed in a minor mode is the State of Israel. Kol Baleva. It's written in you're gonna sing it in A minor, D minor, but it's not da da dum bum bum bum. You can hear the difference between major and minor mode, but only the State of Israel. I don't know what commentary you can make about that, but are we such a, generally either can indicate a little more sadness, but I'd like to think of it as prophetic trope, because the prophets are always chanted in the minor mode. We'll get to the prophets. So that's the Torah reading, and it has a very ancient practice of Torah. We're going to get to some of the specifics, if not this week, then next week. I wanted to get the Siddur next week. Now, turning the pages here, we have all the same. We have page 10 and 11. We have the two comments about being fertile and increase, and heaven and earth, the instructions about Kiddush, etc., etc. Now, if you'll note on page 16, if you go to page 16, you'll see in the margin a little Hebrew word on the right-hand side, which is shlishi. Shlishi means third. Now, that is to indicate the entire portion. So if you were in an Orthodox synagogue, you could bring this Chumash and know that the third reading would begin there. That's not the way we divide it up because we're in a triennial cycle, but the three, let's see where Revi'i is. Revi'i comes on page 23, Revi'i, and on and on. Then we go 5, 6, and then we go to Shvi on page 32, and then we go to page 34, and we see another Hebrew word there, in the right-hand margin, named, called maftir. Now I had one of the, I won't, from someone you don't know, who wanted to chant the Haftarah, the Shabbat. And she said to me, I have not really learned the half Torah. She spelled it H-A-L-F, half Torah. That's not what the word Haftarah means. Haftarah or maftir, you can hear the similarity, comes from three Hebrew letters, Pei, Tet, Resh. When you will see often on a matzeva, on a tombstone, you'll see the person niftar. Often you'll see abbreviation nun pei with a slash. Niftar means someone has passed away. It has been cut off. Literally means being cut off. The root, not only does it refer to death, but you'll see the same root in maftir and haftarah. What it means is when we get to the maftir and we repeat the last verses of the portion we just read, it means that the formal Torah reading has ceased. We recite the Chatzi Kaddish, which indicates that Torah reading has been completed. And then we only, in order to tie the person reading the prophetic portion to the Haftarah, recites the maftir verses here. That's to indicate that the Torah reading is maftir. It has come to an end. And that's where we get a haftarah, means that not only have you ended the Torah reading, you've also completed the maftir reading. So Torah reading, or called Kriya in Hebrew, maftir, and then haftarah. Now we get to the haftarot, page 35. And we have the Hebrew, and it says haftarah for Breshit. The correct pronunciation is haftarah. Some you'll hear it haftorah. That's where people get confused about haftorah. It's really haftarah because it's not about the Torah. It's about the completion. Haftarah is the correct pronunciation. I'm a stickler for correctness. Not political correctness, for Jewish correctness. You didn't catch that one. Okay. And underneath there is the indication of which prophetic portion we are reading from. And we have taken all the traditional prophetic portions. The prophetic literature is after the Torah. And this is an ancient tradition dating back to the Second Temple period. The Haftarot that we use are not randomly chosen. It has a history dating back at least 2,200, 2,300 years. There is a Baba Misa that says that the reason why prophetic portions were created was because there was a period where Torah readings were prohibited by the Romans. And so the Jews got around it a little bit by saying, okay, you won't let us read from the Torah, we'll read from a prophetic passage instead. That's been totally discounted. Just complete nonsense. I don't even know where it came from, because all the work of man and all the others, we know that, especially when I've studied Midrash, there's always a reference to what's going on in the synagogue, and they'll refer to the Torah reading, prophetic reading, and they did something that we don't do anymore. They had a reading from the Ketuvim, from the third section of the Tanakh. Susan, that would add another 15 minutes to our service. But we're not going to do that because we don't have to anymore. But if you were a Jew living 2,000 years ago, they had a whole series of Ketuvim writings that they read after the prophet. And I'm not sure when that ended. It probably got too long, is my guess. And it just said, well, let's be satisfied. We'll do the Torah reading and the prophetic reading, and everybody will be happy. So we only have a Haftarah today. And you'll see here it says Isaiah chapter 42, verse 5 through chapter 43, verse 10. And that's an Ashkenazic tradition. And included here is if you have a Sephardic leanings, If you want to abbreviate the text, you're under good ground because the Sephardim there have a shorter tradition of the Haftarah.
I have to go to the
And
toilet.
if you could mute yourself, please, for a little while. We're almost done. So we have Michael Fishbane, who's another conservative rabbi who I happen to get to know. He's still around. He was at the University of Chicago. And what he did for the Chumash, he wrote a beautiful, in his very pedantic style, about each Haftarah, where it comes from, if there's a king mentioned or a prophet mentioned, when that prophet lived, for example, mid-6th century, second Isaiah referred to here, introduction to the text, what it's about. And then on page 36, he always has a section called Relating the Haftarah to the Torah portion. The rabbis didn't just pick portions out of the blue. If the Torah portion deals with creation, then the Haftarah, as Dr. Fishbane notes here, there are recitations in the verses from Isaiah that refer to creation. So you see there's a connection between the Torah reading and the prophetic portion. They weren't just chosen willy-nilly. Now, unlike the Torah reading that's read in chronological order, the Haftarot can be from Isaiah this week. The Haftarah for this coming Shabbat of Vayetze is from Hosea, the prophet Hosea. It was very interesting. And yeah, the Sephardim have the same tradition. It could be Hosea this week, could be from 2 Kings next week. It could be from Isaiah the next week. They're all over the place, depending on the relationship to the Torah portion. Now, if you note, let's say the Haftarah on page 189, we chanted the Torah trope, and I'm gonna again give you to show you the difference in music. If I'm the maftir on page 187, I would chant the following: Vayashkem Lavan Baboker, Vayanashek Levanav Livnotav Yivarech Edhem, Vayelech Vayashov Lavan Limkomo, etc. That would be the Torah portion. But if I'm chanting the Haftarah on page 189, the music changes. And now I have to get my head into the Haftarah. Just a second. Vayevrach Yaakov Sedei Aram, Vayavo Yisrael Beisha Uvisha Shamar Uvenavi He'ela Adonai Israel Mimisraim Uvenavi Nishmar. So you hear the difference. Now, I got to learn the Ashkenazic trope, which is generally called a German trope, which is used in every synagogue in the United Kingdom. So the last 10 years, I had to change from the Eastern European trope. There's Lithuanian trope, there's Ukrainian trope. There are hundreds of trope patterns. They're all right. There are certain patterns in the music that we're accustomed to hearing. Tivir, Mapa Pashta, Sakev Katon. There are patterns of the music. There are 22 different ta'amim trope. And you will hear differences between the German trope and the Eastern European trope. What is fascinating, though, I have heard trope from Iraq, Tunisia Jews, Egyptian Jews, and those tropes are completely different. I don't know where that comes from. There was a Torah reader that I absolutely loved. He was an Egyptian Jew, Yitzchak, and he chanted the Torah readings in Egyptian trope. I couldn't learn it. It was a totally different sound. but it was beautiful. Was he wrong to chant the Torah in Egypt? Absolutely not. So if we have someone here visiting from Egypt, the Egyptian Jew, who wants to read Torah, let him or her read Torah on the trope that she wants to read. It's a beautiful, the idea of music in Judaism is to expand our cultural awareness. It's not a fixed tradition. Israel? Again, I'll try. It's hard to switch overnight between major da 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 da. Now see, now you got half Torah trope. Da 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 da. That's from the Avia. We all know the Avia Hafta. That's in a major music mode. But if I go to the Haftorah, just listen to the, if you can. Da 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 da. Da 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 dum, da 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 dum, da 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 dum. It's a different music. Da 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 da. Minor. Da da dum 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 dum. Major. I'm glad Happy Birthday wasn't written in a minor trope. Dum bum 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 dum dum bum bum bum. Major. I have to think of a good da 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 dum da 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 dum da 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 minor Beethoven. Thank you for allowing me to teach a little music here. Yeah. Yeah. What do you mean each of them? Yeah, well, every one of these musical notes has a different musical pattern. Yes. In the Huff, they're the same pattern, but one is major and one is minor. That's kind of a very quick lesson in all of this. Anyway, that's what we have in our Chumash here. And we're coming to the close. Of course, I didn't even get nearly done. Look what I had here. Public reading of the Torah. When is it read? Who can learn? What is an aliyah? How to do an aliyah? How about the number of tropes? Maftir we did. Rules of the Torah reading. So we'll get to that next week. I'm in no rush to cover everything in accordance with our syllabus. I'll redo the syllabus at some point. And then I wanted to start about prayer and how it started and different kinds of Jewish prayers. But just be patient, everybody. Let's take a couple questions we have just about the Chumash. Shesha? Yeah. Bredler, he's great. Great. Interesting. Well, the problem with any translation, it's an excellent translation. Is it perfect? No, because we have multiple. I can open up pages of the Midrash and see 100 different commentaries about one word. So how do you translate something in which there are so many different interpretations? So it's really tough once you have a translation, you're limiting the interpretation of a text. I have, if you've noticed here on a regular basis, sometimes I will take issue with a particular translation or wanting to expand our knowledge of a translation. But I can imagine how difficult it was to come up with any translation, because a translation almost implies an interpretation that might not include all interpretations, like fascinating stuff about what that means, cleaver and knife. So it's like, I guess if you were to read a Chinese translation of Shakespeare, you'd probably be a little put off by the way something is interpreted, because you know the English better, and you would say, Nice try, but you didn't quite make it. So translations by definition. Now, Robert Alter, who was like another one of my teachers at the University of California, Berkeley, wrote a book, which I have not read, about translations, because he came out with a new translation of the entire Tanakh about 4 years ago. I don't have it. I have only part of it. I don't have the whole series. He's a brilliant scholar, and he dissects words. He'll have explanations of why he translated words a certain way with all kinds of explanations. So it's a study into itself. And he wrote a book about translations, just about the variations. The King James Bible is a very limited translation because we're dealing with English from the early 17th century. Imagine the thought process was very different back then, and their understanding of Hebrew was very different. These were, well, James wanted to revert back to Catholicism, but their knowledge of Hebrew was very much tailored after what they had learned about their Old Testament leading to the New Testament. So the translation is very Christianized, very limited because of the language. Obviously, it always helps to explore translations if you know the Hebrew, because then you can, I'm looking at the random page here, see if there's anything. Toavat, like the word abomination, toavah, I don't know how they translate that, abhorrent. Have something abhorrent, abomination. Well, that's not bad. Isur fuva ish. Tishmeru lasot. That's not anything. Every page is different. Some pages have more controversial text. For example, here I'll show you what I did this week. If we turn to the beginning of Toldot, it's fascinating because I noticed this, and it was really bizarre that they had the chutzpah not to translate it correctly. And I don't know what the thinking was there. Like if you turn to page page 147, verse 25. It says, Vayetze Harishon. I'm going to read the Hebrew. You look at the English, see if I'm just doing a translation off of the Hebrew. Vayetze Harishon Admoni. So the first one who came out red, Kulo Ka'aderet Se'ar. He was like a hairy red thing. V'yikra'u Shemo Esav. And they named him Esav. All right. So that's a good translation, right? Verse 26, V'acharei Cain yatsa achiv. And after that came his brother. V'yado ochezet ba'akev Esav. And his hand was holding on to the heel of Esav. V'yikra shemo Yaakov. And he called his name Jacob. V'yitzchak ben shishim shana beledet otam. And Isaac was 60 years old when they gave birth to them, when they were born. So, but look at the translation. Then his brother emerged holding on to the heel of Esav. So they named him Jacob. That's not what the Hebrew says. Vayikra shemo Yaakov. He named him Jacob. Who's the he? Was it God named him Jacob? Was it Isaac who named him Jacob? It certainly couldn't refer to Rivka because she's a female and it's written in the masculine Hebrew. It shows you how much fun the Hebrew is. I don't, let's see, is there any commentary here? I didn't really look at the commentary. Yeah, no, it just speaks of the name Jacob, but there's no comment about why the translation is they. I guess the feeling was that they had to strike a balance between the two, but it misses. All the rabbis had a field day with that, as I discovered. They and he, what's going on? And virtually every page of the Torah, you can find these idiosyncrasies in translation. See how much fun it is? We've just begun, because I hope, I love these drashot when I take a word or an expression and try to refashion it from the translation that we have. because the Torah should be expansive, never changing. That's why you have Brettler, who's a relatively, I mean, he's been around for a while, recent scholar. He has a different take based on, now we're going to be studying with John Barton in December. And here boy, he knows every Hebrew word and dissects every word in the text. We can ask him that question about translations, what translation he likes. In fact, I would guess that his Oxford translation of the Bible, he was the one who spearheaded it. So it'd be a fascinating question to ask him, how he rates the JPS translation, the New Revised Translation, the Catholic translation, the Jerusalem Bible, Oxford translation, which is his. They're all good, but they're all translations, and so there's interpretation involved. Yeah, go ahead, Cheryl, then we'll finish up. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get to that with Aliyot. Yeah, the question is about women reading the Torah. We know from the Mishnah that it was embarrassing to the men that the women were doing all the Torah reading. And that's why in the Mishnah it says that the men should be reading Torah because it's a busha b'tzibur. It was an embarrassment in public. And most scholars do assume then the embarrassment in public was like, come on, man, you're not doing any of the Torah reading. So they would try to reverse it, make the men obligated. Mishnah is 2nd century, 1st and 2nd century. Isn't that fascinating? We really don't know, but you have to try to understand what was the embarrassment to the public that the men had to become required to read. You know, so what was, and many assume it was because there's a reference in the Jerusalem Talmud, another text, that the women were doing all the Torah reading. Isn't that great? See how things go in cycles. And then the men shove the women out completely. And here we are today trying to bring them back. It's how ritual change. Listen, my hope is that whether you agree or disagree with Jewish law and custom, my goal is to make sure that everybody is educated where things come from. I will be very happy. Then we can have a great discussion about, they used to do it back then. Should we make the change though today? You know, it becomes a very different kind of discussion rather than just, well, this is the way they've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's not usually the case. It evolves. Things evolve. Anyway, questions from anybody in the, I see you all here. I hope you were able to follow. Claire has a question.
No, it's not really a question. It's just to tell you, I remember the name of that gentleman. His name's Peter Batkin.
Peter Batkin. Oh, why did I forget him? Because he was, we were very close. What a dear, interesting guy. Peter and Judy. Yeah. Great people. Yeah. And Alice, their daughter.
Yeah.
Theo.
Right.
And they had a son named Theo.
Yes.
Yeah. I do remember things once in a while. Anybody? Well, I think we're kind of run over here. So next Tuesday, we will continue with some things with the Chumash, and then we'll get right into the Sidur. Because my goal here is that everybody understand our services. What?
Mixed seating.
Next what? Next
seating. Sitting together.
Next Tuesday. What did I say? Wednesday?
Very British.
Oh, a mixed seating. We didn't do that. Please remind me, because that's a fascinating subject of mine, and I'll share with you. I grew up, my first synagogue I went to was Orthodox, and they had mixed seating back in the early years. So the question is, how the heck did the Orthodox synagogues change? You too. I went to and my uncle and aunt in Chicago, Skokokie Valley congregation, Orthodox synagogue, mixed seating. Why did they change? Next week, we'll find out. Jewish stuff we're so bizarre, but we're so.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
We'll be back here tomorrow at 10 o'clock for the prophets.